Okay, I think as it's 2 minutes past, we can get going. Um, so welcome everyone to this SCAP training session as part of our regular series of IUA claims training. And thank you very much for joining. My name's Faye Hepburn and I'm the underwriting claims technician at the IUA. Before we get started, I just have a few bits of housekeeping. So we are recording the session and we'll make the recording available on the IUA YouTube channel. We'll also be sharing the slides from the session in a few days' time. In advance of the session, we shared a link to the SCAP guidance. So please do take a look at that as things from that are referenced in the session. And we want the session to be as interactive as possible. So we will have polls throughout. There's a Q&A facility. So please do take full advantage of that. And so as we all know, SCAP is an incredibly important concept for claims practitioners and is a key role in claims processing. So with that, we're very lucky to have an expert in the field, Charlotte Warr, Managing Director at Sarnia Training, to lead this session today. I'll pass it over to you, Charlotte.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Faye, and good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever everybody else happens to be. And exactly as Faye said, we're going to be talking about SCAP today. It is an incredibly important and useful process for us as claims people, but it requires every stakeholder to really be focusing on what they're doing, because as I will be talking about as we go through, it's what I call a bit of a spit and sawdust with a bit of blue tack thrown in process. The technology does not help us. So these are the objectives, and the slides will be made available to you afterwards as well. We just need to set the scene. Why was SCAP introduced? What's the point of it? Is it anything new and novel? And the answer to that question is no. Really important to just talk about when you can use it, when you can't use it, what types of placement you can use it for, etc. And then part of the reason for the polling questions is to actually ask you, and I have no idea who the 74 people sitting around the table actually are in terms of which part of the market you come from, to ask different parts of the market why you are or particularly are not using it. We'll talk a little bit about changes that could happen. I don't have a magic sort of view into the future, but we can talk about some of the things that have been suggested and talk about where we are as a market with those. And then, as I've said, reinforce every single stakeholder's role in making sure that if it is going to be used, it works. So all of the polls are anonymous. And so please don't be worried about the answers that you give, but it's really helpful if you are within the group that I'm asking the question of, that you do give your answers, because it does inform the trade bodies like the IUA about what the mood music is, shall we say, of the market. So why was it introduced? Well, fundamentally, it was introduced to try and put in place a cross-market leader-only agreement framework, recognizing that there are some claims which quite simply are very small in value, very simple in form. They really don't need more than one experienced pair of eyes looking at them for the entirety of not only the London market, but potentially overseas carriers as well. Leader only is by no means a new idea at all. It's just the latest incarnation of that new idea. And of course, everybody benefits from it. The client benefits from it because they have their claims dealt with hopefully much quicker. Insurers and brokers also benefit from it because there is just sensible use of resources as well. So, what makes a claim eligible for SCAP? Well, I talked about its financial value, and you'll see there the value of 250,000 GBP. Well, what does that represent? Well, firstly, it must represent the net value of the claim. So that's net of deductibles or excesses or underlying retentions. And it is the number of the net claim to all of the SCAP participants. Now, it's not just London market insurers that can agree to be bound by the SCAP rules. And so when, as a broker, you're looking to see, right, okay, is this claim at the moment within the financial eligibility rules? Don't just focus on, the numbers for the Lloyd's market or even the numbers for the London market. Look at the contract, and we'll talk more about the contract in a minute. Okay, which insurers have signed up to it? Now, you will see the reference there to the leader considering whether the value might go up. If we think about the way that the claims are typically handled in London, it's a bit like a game of rounders, really, where, particularly using ECF, the broker starts the process by effectively throwing the ball in terms of data and documents in the direction of insurers. And so it'll be the broker that will look at the claim in the first instance and go, well, do I think it's SCAP eligible? But it is always the leader's decision about whether it is SCAP eligible or not. And it's absolutely within the leader's prerogative right from the get-go to say, right, okay, the numbers look okay at the moment, but we think they're going to blow. And so actually, no, we're not going to handle it within the SCAP rules. So that's the numbers side. In terms of the factual side, nothing complex or controversial about the claim at all. And there's no sort of definitive examples necessarily in the SCAP guidelines, other than there can be no active coverage dispute proceedings or activity in place. But I think, as experienced claims people, we know those sorts of things that can be troublesome. I mean, the obvious ones are, anything to do with sanctions or anything to do with financial crime or anything like that. So it's just, is there anything about the claim that just makes it anything other than a claim that literally is no question at all around coverage, no question around quantum, numbers are low enough, buff, straight down the pipe. So let's have our first two polling questions. So the first one is for the brokers. So Justin, can we have our first poll, please? So just if we have brokers around the room, if you could answer that for me, please. And then Justin will throw up the answers in a minute, or the responses. Okay, Justin, let's have a look at some of the responses, please. See what votes we're getting. Okay, so I'm very glad that nobody's saying from the broking fraternity that they weren't aware of it at all. That's good, because it's been around now nearly 10 years, so hopefully the awareness should be there. In terms of the second group who are saying they don't really understand how it works, well, hopefully by the end of today's session you will. We'll come back to the limits being too low. And for those of you that have said any other reason, if there's something that you might want to pop into the Q&A, then that would be great. So the next polling question, please, Justin, and this is targeted at our underwriters around the table. And if you're a claims person but know the kind of the mood of your underwriters, please feel free to answer it. Okay, Justin, everybody should have had a chance to vote, so let's see what the answers are. Okay, so again, hopefully we can resolve the not really sure how it works conundrum. We'll talk about the limits towards the end, particularly when we talk about what the future of SCAP might be. It's interesting, that point around the lack of comfort with the overall leaders claims team, because I put this question up every time, and we've done this session between 2 and 4 times a year for the last 2 to 3 years. and it's still coming up. And I think certainly from a Lloyd's perspective, they would be concerned about that if there is any lack of comfort in the claims team in a lead position in a Lloyd's syndicate. But it's interesting, and this is what I mean about informing the trade bodies, that it is still up there as an issue. And again, with the any other reason, then if there's anything that we can pick up as part of the Q&A at the end, it would be really helpful to do that. That's brilliant. Thank you very much, Justin. So, moving on. Well, we've dealt with that first bullet, haven't we? So the starting point is that all parties involved in the placement process need to know that it exists at all. Now, to be fair, if you look at the MRC V3 open market template, which you're going to use for open market business, you also use for decks for line slips, it's built in to that template. So it would be difficult now, sort of nearly 10 years down the line, to say, oh, well, I didn't know it existed, I've forgotten to put it into the template. So that really deals with bullet 2 as well. There are some placement arrangements, shall we say, that you can't use it for. You can't use it on proportional treaties and you can't use it on binding authorities, but you can use it for everything else, okay? And you can use it in every class of business. There is no class of business that is exempt from the ability to use SCAP. Having said that, there are some classes of business whose claims tend to be inherently big and messy, and so are not likely to fall within the eligibility criteria. And so they sort of by default effectively won't use it. But according to the rules, strictly speaking, no class of business out of scope. So, whilst I said that any insurer could choose to be bound by the SCAP rules, and that includes overseas market, there are very specific criteria of who can be the SCAP slip leader, who is the intellectual decision maker. Now, I'm just going to pause for a moment because I can see a Q&A question coming up, and a very sound question, which is, what is the rationale for binders being out of scope? And I think actually at the time that SCAP was being created, if one wants to put it that way, there was concern that just the complexity of binding authority business with the bordereaux and the over authority amounts would just make it too complicated given already existing complications. Having said that, of course, what we now have in the binder environment is the co-lead claims agreements scenario, which is kind of SCAP-esque in its thinking, in that it's all about, doesn't matter how a risk is placed, how a risk is signed, it satisfies the Lloyd's requirement that there be only one decision maker and occasionally two. So I think the reality is that the kind of binder world's moved on a little bit from it, but still doesn't have that basic idea of, within the context of a single binder, being able to have that single decision maker. Whether that will change going forward, I don't know, but it's something to take up with the trade bodies. So, who can be our intellectual decision makers, as I call them, the SCAP slip leaders? Those insurers have to satisfy certain criteria. They can be a Lloyd's syndicate, and hopefully we have some syndicate friends sitting around the table, or they can be a UK authorised insurer. Now, be clear, a UK authorised insurer is not the same thing as an IUA member company. There is an awful lot of crossover. Of course there is. But you could have a UK authorised insurer that is outside the London market. It would be rare, but it could happen. And they can legitimately be the SCAP slip leader. Remember, of course, also that Lloyd's Insurance Company, Lloyd's Brussels, if you want to prefer to call it that, they have a UK branch and they are a UK authorised insurer. And so they can, and are in some cases, SCAP slip leaders. Now, at the point of placement for our brokers sitting around the table, it's really important that if you are trying to get your overseas security to agree to be bound by SCAP, that they understand what they're signing up to. And so the best practice discipline with the slip templates is to have the SCAP wording in there in full, which is about 6 pages long. And then, of course, last but not least, it's really important that anybody handling the claims actually understands how the mechanism works. And this is actually the most complicated bit, because as I've said, SCAP is a bit spit, sawdust and blue tag. And it's very, very easy for the whole thing to become derailed really, really quickly. And so very much what I'm going to be talking about today is the importance of everybody knowing not only what to do, but also what not to do. So let's move on. Practicalities. In a subscription market slip, if the Lloyd's leader agrees that SCAP can be in the slip, and as I said, nowadays SCAP is built into the template, so it would be needing to forcibly take it out, then all of the other syndicates that are subscribing to that slip under the same UMR will be automatically bound for SCAP. In the company market, not so. Company market, each insurer makes their own decisions. For our brokers sitting around the table, hopefully you're going to be working hard to try and get them all to agree, because otherwise it's going to be very, very messy. You may well have to either put specific language in the slip or potentially have a split placement, which again is going to be difficult for any post-bind activities. So what's the sort of headline, high-level view of the claims process? Well, starts off with a claim obviously coming into the brokers. They're going to look at it and go, right, do we consider that this claim at this point in time satisfies the SCAP eligibility criteria? Then the broker will, as long as the claim is within the scope of ECF, and we will for the moment assume that it is, load the claim onto whatever combination of the 3 versions of ECF are required for the London market security necessary. But the important thing is to put a code. So the SCAP code. There's no dedicated field for it. It needs to go in the lost name field, and it needs to be the first characters. Now, I know that this has, well, it's certainly been identified to me that this poses a problem for batch brokers that might have SCAP coding that is the later characters in the lost name field in terms of their systems as it populates into class. But for the process to work, the SCAP code needs to be at the beginning. So the SCAP code is made up of 2 elements. The first bit's the easy bit, the letters SCAP, and then one of 4 codes, which identify the part of the market that the intellectual decision maker lives in. So L for the Lerma market, I for the ILU market, S for the syndicate market, and NB for an eligible leader, but who does not use the bureau processes. So in our little example here, this claim has been coded SCAP L, so the intellectual decision makers in the Lerma market. Remember what I said about the most important bit is what you should not do. The broker has to load the claim onto ILU and Lloyd's ECF if such markets exist for that claim. And so it will appear in the leaders of those 2 markets to-do list. And how easy is it for you to go, well, if it's in my to-do list, surely I need to do something? No. For SCAP to work, you need to leave it alone. Because if you leave it alone, once the leader deals with it, then the robots and their friendly humans at Velanetic, DXC, exchanging, whatever you want to call them, will take over. And that's what makes the process work smoothly. And a lot of people say, well, actually, yeah, we're not convinced it works. It does work. You know, the stats that come out show that it does work. And it works most of the time. Why doesn't it work? Well, It's going to be a mixture of two things. Humans getting in the way and a scenario where it was never going to work. So what I mean by humans getting in the way, well, something appearing in your to-do list and you going, oh, it's in my to-do list, I've got to respond to it. No, check what it is first. Or, for example, if the leader is outside the bureau market, and remember that if the leader is Lloyd's Insurance Company, it will be coded as NB, because although they're an insurance company, they don't use the company version of ECF. And so the comments have to come from them first, or whoever's handling the claims for them first, and then be loaded into the repository. And sometimes that's forgotten. We've already talked about the incorrect loss name prefix. And then, for example, if the intellectual decision maker is in the Lerma market, then the human that's handling the claim can fill in the mandatory fields. If they're in another market, the velinetic robots can't do that bit that is needed, and so their humans have to do it. It's not the end of the world. It just means a human is interacting with it, a velinetic. So, as claims people on the broking side, we need to check it's in the slip. We can't use the SCAP protocols if it's not in the slip. And we've already seen from those polling questions that some of our underwriting communities are going to be actively, by the looks of it, taking it out, even if it's in the templates. And so if it has been taken out, when you're looking at the slip as a broker's claims person, there's nowhere to go. You're going to have to handle the claim under the ordinary rules, you know, the Lloyd's claims lead arrangements and the RUA claims handling guidelines, unless further conversations can be had with insurers to get them to endorse the SCAP in. But that's going to take too long, really, in terms of any claim you need to be handling now. Let's assume that it is in, and the underwriters are saying no. Well, that's a conversation as part of the loop around between claims and placing as well. And then, of course, remember, if you are handling a claim on a binding authority, you are handling a claim on a quota share reinsurance treaty, then SCAP doesn't come into play anyway. So every insurer is going to fit into one of three descriptive buckets, as it were. One of them will be the overarching slip leader, the intellectual decision maker, as I'm calling them. Some others will be bureau leaders. So let's say we've got Lloyd's, Lerma, and ILU. So we've got all three bureau. We'll put our intellectual decision maker in the Lerma market. So they will be both the intellectual decision maker, slip leader, and the Lerma bureau leader. And then there will be an ILU bureau leader, and there will be a Lloyd's bureau leader. And then everybody else will just be followers. Now, the key thing is remember that those followers could also be in the overseas market. And it's important to understand that they do have rights. They just will not have a direct involvement with the handling of the claim. Now, I've told you that it can't be used on binding authorities, but it absolutely can be used on line slips. But you've got to be really careful here, because when a broker is setting up a line slip, you can have SCAP in there and identify who the SCAP leader is going to be for risks attaching to that line slip. Lovely, fairly straightforward. But then think about the process of attaching declarations to a line slip. If the declaration is small enough so that the capacity available under the line slip is enough to cover the entire risk, then lovely. The only security on that declaration will be the line slip, so there is no difference in the claims decision makers. But you could have a risk of being attached or declared to a line slip where actually the line slip security is only forming part of the security on that declaration. There might be two line slips. There might be line slip with some open market. Doesn't really matter what the combo is. But what needs to be really clear on the declaration is for that declaration, who the claims decision makers are. And if SCAP is being used in that declaration, who the SCAP leader will be. And therefore, of course, for our insurers sitting around the table, you might lead a line slip, but you may not necessarily lead every declaration coming off that line slip. And again, that's also important for our claims brokers sitting around the table to say, right, okay, if I am dealing with a claim, to whom do I point the request for a decision? So, talked a lot about this code, this value. I cannot emphasize enough the importance of this. Remember, spit, sawdust, blue tack. This is quite a blue tacky thing. Okay, this is what's going to hold things together, because you put it in that loss name. It means that humans looking at that claim in their to-do list can go, aha, right, I am the slip leader, I need to be dealing with this. Or I am not, it is merely in my to-do list because of the limitations of ECF. Remember, 3 versions of ECF that are like really grumpy next door neighbours and really don't talk to each other. But it's really important also for the robots at DXC/Velonetic, because the robots need to see that SCAP code. And so one of the things it's really important to understand is that the robots need to be able to distinguish that SCAP code in the loss name, and therefore there needs to be a space between the end of the code and the beginning of the loss name. And so if you've got, you know, SCAP I Fay and no gap in between, the robot just can't see the SCAP I bit in that splodge of data. If you have SCAP I space Fay, lovely. All other things being equal, the robot will be able to pick it up. And the reason the robot needs to pick it up is because of something called a SCAP notification report, which goes out every day to certain participants in that particular risk. So, if you're a claims broker, you're going to be putting the claim into whichever combinations of ECF you want. You're going to be making sure that that SCAP code is in each of those 3 pipelines loss names. And then please remember, if it happens to be that your SCAP slip leader is non-bureau, you need to have communicated with them first, because you need to be loading up the comms with them into the IMR to support that first transaction. You'll see that last bullet about the transactions all being aligned. This is more difficult than it sounds, for the very simple reason that the functionality in the 3 versions of ECF is very different. Let me give you a very practical example. In the world of Lerma, if there is a problem with data in a transaction and the leader hasn't spotted it before they circulate it, then the followers might infit, that's their version of to query. Now, at that point, the broker cannot correct the data in that transaction. It's locked by the circulation process. And so the quite normal, natural, perfectly acceptable resolution of that query is to load in a new transaction, hopefully with nice, shiny, clean data in it. That's fine. That's not the same process on the ILU and the Lloyd's side. And on the ILU and the Lloyd's side, if there's problematic data, and for example, on the Lloyd's side, it's queried, that query blocks the pipe. That transaction has to have one of 2 things happen to it. Either it be deleted, or it actually be revised effectively and reissued. So all of a sudden, if we actually had a query on the Lloyd's side and an inf on the Lerma side, we've potentially got a dislocate in the transactions. We cannot have a dislocate in the transactions for SCAP to work properly. There needs to be every transaction needs to have effectively a line item for each of the markets involved. And so if you do have a query type scenario on the Lerma side and queries are popping up on the Lloyd's side as well, it's maybe better to actually think about deleting everything and starting again. So, as I said earlier, as a broker, when you're looking at a claim, you're going to go, I think this is eligible to be handled under SCAP. And that's entirely your prerogative. So you are presenting the claim to the SCAP slip leader to say, I believe this claim is SCAP eligible. Absolutely. It's the leader's final decision about, firstly, whether it's SCAP eligible at FNOL, and then secondly, whether it stays in SCAP or not. Because it is entirely possible that you could have a claim that looked fairly, calm, benign, within the criteria. It starts its life as a SCAP claim. That's absolutely fine. And then something comes out of left field that makes it complex, or the numbers go up over the tolerance. And then in that case, it comes out of SCAP. And if it comes out of SCAP, then the claims handling reverts to normal. So Lloyd's claims lead arrangements, IUA claims agreement parties, and overseas markets all handling for themselves. And of course, what that means in practice is if the SCAP slip leader, for example, was in the Lloyd's market, it came out of SCAP, that anybody looking at it in the company market is going to be effectively reading into a file partway through. Absolutely, that is the reality of it. Now, if you have read, any of you, the guidance notes that support SCAP, and well done for you if you have, then there is also an expectation that leaders will look at claims that have not been presented under the SCAP rules and say to the brokers, we believe that this claim is SCAP eligible, please represent. Now, I look at a lot of claims, and I think I can probably count the times that I've seen that actually happening on the fingers of one hand. Just be aware that that is there as an expectation, but better off focus on getting everything else that we're talking about done correctly. So, I know it sounds like I'm repeating myself, and I am repeating myself because I'm constantly seeing this not being done properly. The most important thing when you look at a SCAP claim in your workflow is to have that conversation with yourself. And I don't care if you hear my voice in the back of your head that goes, is this for me to deal with as a leader? Or is it just here in my to-do list because of the limitations of ECF and Charlotte says I've got to leave it alone? Because really, really important. If it's that latter one, if you can hear that voice in your head, Charlotte says leave it alone, leave it alone. Because if the process works properly, once the leader deals with it, it will disappear from your workflow because the Velinetic DXC robots and their humans will deal with it. Okay? So let's start talking a little bit about what DXC Velinetic and the robots and their humans are doing. Well, effectively what they're doing is they are responding in ECF for the non-slip lead market. For my colleagues sitting around the table that are from the Lloyd's market, what will also happen is that Velinetic will put SCAP in actually as the cause code. And so that comes out on the SCM overnight. And then also what we've got is this daily SCAP notification report going out. So let's talk about what that involves in a minute. So it's a daily report. And why it's important to know that it's a daily report rather than a cumulative report is that whoever is looking at it needs to be getting on and looking at it in its totality every day. So it will allow you to highlight anything where, for example, you might need to be looking at something for a sanctions issue, for a Medicare issue. Now, those are two examples where we would normally expect the leaders to pull the claim out of SCAP. But it will also tell you, for example, if the overall decision maker has actually queried the transaction as well. So, our friendly robot that I keep talking about, if it sees things, so it's the SCAP claim is beautifully coded, a gap in the lost name between the code and the lost name. And the robot sees it, it goes, right, okay, and basically puts it into one of two buckets. The I can deal with this as a robot bucket, and I need my friendly humans to deal with it bucket. So if it can deal with it, what it will be doing is it'll be saying, right, okay, it says SCAP L. Let me go and look at the response given by the Lerma leader. So the Lerma leader on an advice has said CAA, so claim advice agreed. Are there documents at UCR level? Are there documents at UMR level? Don't kid yourself. The robots are not reading the documents. They're just checking that there are documents there. And so if it's happy with all of that, and the overall leader has positively responded to that transaction, then that's exactly what the robot will do. It will do seen and agreed for the Lloyd's side and authorized for the IRU side. Now, what forces the robot to throw it at its humans to say, help, you need to deal with this? Well, anything that's coded as SCAP lead NB, remember I said that the brokers should be loading the communications with the non-bureau leader into the IMR. And I also told you that the robot can't read the documents in the IMR. And so it needs its human friend to read the document, read the comments from the non-bureau leader, and then replicate whatever that response is across the three markets. Particularly with Lerma, there are some mandatory fields that need to be completed at FNOL, so class, subclass, that type of thing. And so the friendly human needs to do that at FNOL if it's just a Lerma bureau lead, not a Lerma overall lead. And then, as I've said before, any problems with the SCAP lost name that the robot goes, I'm not sure if this is something I should deal with, human, go and have a look at it. So what makes something go onto an exceptions list? And by an exceptions list, I mean a situation where the SCAP process is not working smoothly. I've already talked about not leaving it alone. And that's really important, and I still see this happening a lot. There not being any documents either at contract level or at claims level. Or again, where you've got a bureau leader. Remember, a bureau leader is not a SCAP overarching leader. That's an insurer in whose workflow the claim has appeared, but they should be leaving it alone. What also causes problems is if they haven't positively responded to it. They've queried it, infed it, pended it. And then, and I have seen it happen, and I just don't know quite why, there are different SCAP names being used on different transactions. Again, that sends the poor old robot into a little spasm. So, again, where a human has to be involved, they will do the things that the robot can't. So read a non-bureau set of comments. They will fill in those Lerma mandatory boxes at FNOL. But then they'll do exactly the same as the robot. They will say, right, okay, non-bureau leader has said agree pay. Right, we will do an agree pay response in each of the ECF markets that are there. Now, if you are, for any of our insurers sitting around the table, that SCAP slip leader, what can you do? Well, basically, you can do your day job. You can instruct experts. That's absolutely fine. You can decline a claim. That's absolutely fine. But if that declinature is kind of the nature where you think, right, well, this is maybe going to get messy and maybe I just don't want to necessarily put chapter and verse into public comments and stuff like that. That's the sort of thing that's going to be making you go, do you know what? This has got to come out of SCAP. Now, although SCAP can't be used for binding authorities, it can be used for line slips. And remember that claims on line slips can be presented in a bordereau format. That's absolutely fine as long as every line item on the bordereau is sub 250 net. then that's absolutely fine. Whatever the aggregate value of the bordereau is, the leader can still handle it. And then in terms of loss funds and escrows, which again can exist outside a binding authority environment, that's absolutely fine. They can be dealt with whatever the size, because they are not sort of deemed to be individual claim actions. They're more administrative actions. So I've talked about the fact that a claim can leave SCAP. And in terms of who prompts the conversation, there's absolutely no reason why it always has to be the leader that prompts the conversation. The broker can prompt the conversation to go, actually, do you know what? I think this claim is now not eligible. Now, as I said, it could be non-eligible now because the numbers are too high. Now, be mindful that in the SCAP guidelines, which I know you've all read, it says that when you're looking at a claim presented in another currency, remember the rules are in GBP, that you use the Bank of England spot rate. Now, the intention is not that claims will flim-flam in and out of SCAP just because of rate of exchange volatility. Okay, and hopefully that's reasonably common sense. If there is agreement between the broker and the SCAP slip leader that the claim is no longer eligible, then very simply, at the next transaction, the SCAP code comes off, and then it goes back to the traditional Lloyd's Claims and Lead Arrangements, IUA. Now, the reverse can happen. A claim can start its life, theoretically, being handled under what we'll call the ordinary rules. It could then go into SCAP. But if it is going to go into SCAP, that is not the unilateral decision of the leader. Anybody who has been an agreement party up until now, so that could be Lloyd's leader, ILU leader, and everybody in the Lerma side, plus any overseas, they all have to agree to that. So we can imagine that is going to be quite difficult to facilitate. Theoretically, it can be done, but it's far less likely. So let's have a few sort of questions that have popped up over time. Remember what I said earlier about the sort of mismatch between transactions. One of the things that I see a lot is, or get people contacting me to go and have a look and see what's going on. They'll contact me and they'll say, there's a transaction in my workflow, and I know that we're not the SCAP slip leader, and I've done everything that you've told me, and I've left it alone, and it's still there, and it's growing whiskers. What the hell's happening? So I'll say, well, there's one of two things that's likely to be happening. And you have to go into ECF itself as insurers to see this. If you're working through write-back systems, you won't see it via the write-back systems. You have to go behind the scenes into ECF. Go in and look at the claim. And when you click on the UCR, it will take you to a page which shows you all the transactions for the market. So let's say there's all three. And you're going to see one of two things. Either that the leader hasn't actually yet responded. So the process hasn't failed to work. It's just that the trigger of the leader responding hasn't been fired. But what I'm seeing too often is I'll go in, I'll look at the claim, I will see that the UCR that is sitting in whoever's contacted me's workflow, but that's the only UCR. There are definitely three markets on it, but for some reason, a UCR's only been put in for one market, and that's not the leader. Doesn't work like that. Okay. If you've got, say, three markets in play, every time there's a transaction, there has to be a transaction for all markets. Okay. So just be really, really mindful of that. We've talked about removing the claim from SCAP. Now, I don't know whether sitting around the table, I have got anybody from experts that collect their own fees or the fee collection agents. And I'm often asked the question, well, can a parallel UCR be SCAP? And the answer is yes, if the main claim is SCAP. And so this comes with a separate caveat that if you are a fee collector and you are being asked to collect fees, for example, by insurers, then they should be telling you, or perhaps it's a question that you should ask them about whether the claim is being handled as SCAP. If you're a fee collector, or in fact an expert collecting their own fees, you're not necessarily going to know that. But it's not a question that you should be precluded from asking. It's about knowing the question. And so if you know that the main claim is being handled as SCAP, then absolutely you are more than entitled under the rules to present the fees as SCAP as well. But again, just remember you need to be, or you need to have that visibility of the whole market available to get it to work properly. So what about for any colleagues we have sitting around the table from the ILU market? Well, remember, only the ILU members will probably know this, but the rules of the game for the ILU, of course, are that leaders will agree advices, but for settlements, then under some circumstances, the second ILU is involved as well. Well, quite simply, untick the second ILU to make sure that they don't get involved. For sanctions and Medicare, classic examples of where we've now got a bit of a complexity issue going on here. Get it out of SCAP. Now, for our Lerma friends sitting around the table, same point about sanctions and Medicare. Now, what about your lead reserve field? Now, the lead reserve fields, of course, in Lerma are completely transparent to the brokers as well as all the Lerma carriers. But if you're a Lerma carrier and you are the SCAP slip lead, please don't use the lead reserve field because nobody else can see it in the other markets, i.e. the ILU market, in the Lloyd's market, etc. Okay, if you do want to use it, then you're going to have to think of another way, particularly for some reason the broker won't communicate it, but as it's visible to the broker, why wouldn't they? Of making sure that everybody else knows what's going on. Now, one of the advantages, I suppose you want purposes maybe, of the SCAP notification report is to allow Lerma followers to actually object to something that has been done in their name by a Lerma leader. But if you remember, I said that it's a daily report and whoever's looking at it's got to be quick on the draw. Well, this is very true here because you only have one day to object to something. Okay. And then those of you that are familiar with the Lerma ECF functionality, you will know that one of the radio buttons that's available to you is labelled contractual condition applies. And the three options are yes, no, and small claim. It defaults to no. Leave it. Leave it alone. Because even though arguably there is a contractual condition, to allow the process to work properly and the robots to do their job down at Valanetic, just leave that as its default of no. Now, for our friends in Lloyd's, your lead reserves, of course, are invisible to anybody else other than other Lloyd's carriers and Valanetic. So if you are using the lead reserve to split a broker-presented reserve into its constituent parts of indemnity and fees, then fine, please carry on doing that because the total number remains the same. If, however, you are seeking to override the broker's presented reserve and ask Valanetic to hold a higher one or a lower one, please don't. Because, of course, the same point as the Lerma lead reserve, it's only visible within that single market, okay? So questions popped up about who receives the SCAP notification report. Well, it's received by all Lerma followers, and I think ILU leads, and I think Lloyd's followers. In terms of who it goes to, in terms of an individual, it goes to whoever your organisation has told Valanetic, DXC, Exchanging to send it to. And so obviously I don't know who posed that question. And so it may be a case of just asking internally, maybe with your claims ops team, to see whether it goes in there. Now, in terms of ECF fields for people on the Lloyd's side, most of the mandatory fields that you have to deal with are still mandatory. So your CAT codes, your claim scheme, your triage, all of those things. So comments, nothing unusual here. Private comments, of course, only viewable by the market in which those private comments were made, not visible to the broker at all. Public comments visible to everybody, cross-market as long as the UCR is the same, and of course also visible to the broker. So as the SCAP slip leader, of course you can query, inf, pend, depending on which bit of the market you happen to be in. Absolutely, that's done in exactly the same way as you would any other claim. But the fact that you have queried will appear in the notification report for everybody that receives it. But particularly if there has been a query, just for the brokers in the room, just please remember and think about how you answer that query. If it's a query coming out of the Lerma market, don't just say, right, I'm going to respond to this query in the normal way, load another transaction on top, because you've now got to dislocate. You're going to have to load additional transactions in for the ILU and the Lloyd's market as well to keep them in parallel. So to just reinforce some of the things I've already said and to actually pick in some new themes as well to actually look at things going forward. It doesn't work as well as it could. Why doesn't it work? Well, part of it is practical things like the coding not being good enough, and so the robots can't see what's going on, etc. Also, there is no net nanny type process, if you want to call it that, no technology solution for anybody, whether it be brokers or carriers, trying to use the process where the sums involved are way over the threshold. Now, right when SCAP was introduced, and this was one of the questions I asked you, there were certain sectors of the market who said, you know, we don't get out of bed for less than $1 million. You know, the levels are far too low for us, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. But what it does is it reduces confidence in the process if it's seen as effectively being abused. We've already talked about the not leaving it alone when you should be leaving it alone. And, you know, if you take only one thing away from this session, that's probably one of the most important. We've talked about the forgetting to load documents, etc., etc. So you've already been sent the guidelines. The full clause itself is built into certainly the open market MRC templates now, and so should always be there. And, you know, right back when we started doing these refreshers at the start of COVID, so 5 odd years ago now, a huge comprehensive set of Q&As was done, and they're still absolutely fit for purpose, and they are still available. So 2 more polling questions. So can we have question number 3, please, Justin? So this is for everybody, whichever church you belong to. Please vote. Okay, that should have given you enough time. Let's have a look at the results, please, Justin. Okay. Well, certainly in terms of the visibility of stats, Faye, I'm going to give that to you as homework, please, because I know in the early days of the use of SCAP, there was quite a lot of statistical reporting that was drawn up by the IUA and by the LMA and by LIBA. So speak to Kim and find out what's going on there. I think that would be quite interesting. In terms of the higher limits, let me ask you question number 4. So if we can have question number 4, please, Justin. Thank you. Again, everybody please vote. Okay, well, it's a simple question, so let's see the answers. That's interesting. So, as I've said, when SCAP was first introduced, there were certain parts of the market, certain classes of business, I won't call any of them out by name, that said levels are too low. We think the levels should be 1 million. And then when Lloyd's revised the claim scheme and brought out the new claims lead arrangements, which of course raised the thresholds for claims that would be handled by just one pair of eyes, even within the Lloyd's market, the conversation began again around raising the SCAP threshold level to 1 million. And the view at that time, and of course the Lloyd's claims lead arrangements have now been in place for nearly 2.5 years, was, well, let's just get that bedded in first. And arguably that's pretty well bedded in now. But I think one of the ongoing discussions, debates, points of contention, whatever you want to call it, is that there is not enough evidence out there that with the levels at 250, it's being used properly. And so the view is, well, if it can't be used properly at these levels, why would we want to open up a sort of greater volume of claims to be done using it if it still can't be done? And particularly, I suppose, if we're thinking about that's still that concern about, I'm not comfortable about using it as an insurer because I'm not comfortable about actually who I'm going to be giving my decision-making authority to. So I think as a market, what we need to do is to make sure that we really all understand in our individual stakeholder roles, firstly, what the end-to-end process is. And hopefully those of you that weren't quite sure at the early stages of this session are a little bit more certain now. That you understand your particular role and also the other dependencies around you, what happens before you, what happens after you, and how easily the wheels can fall off the bus. Because as I've said, and I was not kidding, spit, sawdust, blue tack, it is not supported by the technology at all. It is it's a good idea, it's a great idea, but it's entirely dependent on every stakeholder going, right, I understand what my role in the process is, I know what I need to be doing, and more importantly, I know what I need to be not doing. Okay, so that's enough of me sermonizing. Hopefully going to give you lots of time back in your day. But are there any more questions anybody wants to pop into the Q&A? I suspect a number of you know exactly who I am anyway, so you can always pose questions to me directly, you know you can. Or if not, you can always go into your own trade bodies, so the LMA, into the IUA, or into LIBA, of course. Looks like I've sent them all to sleep, Faye.
That's great. Well, thank you so much, Charlotte, and thank you for everyone for joining the session. Just a reminder that we will circulate the slides and the recording will be available on the IUA YouTube channel. And if anyone has any further questions, then please feel free to email us at the IUA or Charlotte. And please look out for any more training sessions that we send out. Great.
Fab.
Thank you.
People.